Good morning.
Good morning.
We're here with Baseera Khan, who is our recent resident to Israel. And she has now been back from Israel, or at least away from Israel, for 2 weeks. So we were discussing the idea of how memories are kept and how they get re-put together. So I guess let me try and start that and bring you back to the situation by asking what your thoughts were before you left, what your anxieties were, what your fears, your expectations might have been, because you were going to a fairly radical place in the world today. Get a pencil. Thank you.
It was not a cut and dry experience or feeling before, because most of my preparation was, find a subletter, try to organize and finish small jobs so I could have this block of time to myself and not have to respond to anything outside of the experience of the travel. So that kind of eclipsed any preconceived ideas of going, and for better or worse. And so every time I had a moment to get online and orient myself or try to understand any anxieties that were cropping up inside, I would be quickly moved to a more present issue, which was just the daily living in Brooklyn. So the best I can remember is that I wanted to have a preconceived idea, but I certainly didn't have essentially the time to do so. And I also had this feeling that I wanted to go on a clean slate and be a completely neutral sort of gray pixel when I went, and because I only know about certain regions in the world based on the access I have with media in the US, and I haven't really traveled much, so I really tried to tame any kind of imaginative, because I'm very imaginative, kind of preconceived ideas. And to be fair, I have been trained in experiencing without preconceived notions, because I'm someone who goes to this film seminar in the summer called, it's a Flaherty seminar, and they've been doing these film seminars for 60 plus years, and part of that is training yourself to not have any preconceived notions of what you're experiencing in the films. They don't tell you about the artist, where it's located or anything, and you sit for 8 hours in the dark and watch films. So I feel like a little bit the question for me is coming from a place where I have been trained to totally be blank when I go and have an experience, which actually is not the best thing sometimes. But
Okay, well, a place like Israel
yes,
has so many political, social
implications.
issues, yeah,
Yes.
that what was your sense of Israel before you went?
Well, I do stay involved with the news. When I was at Cornell University, I was a bit involved with some of the Israeli-Palestinian communities there, activist communities there. My notion of Israel was to question the state, but not necessarily question the people that inhabit. So that was
the politics.
Yeah, that was the space that I was trying to stay in, because I imagined the experience I was going to have was to be involving myself with this kind of micro communities within a state that is highly criticized. So That's really the best way I can answer, because in order to answer that question, I would have to be criticizing the state, and I don't think that I have the education or experience to do that at the moment. So really it was about having no preconceived notions of the people in the micro communities that I was going to be engaging with.
Okay. Israel is generally seen, especially in the art world, as an aggressor state.
And so is the United States.
Certainly is. So when you were there, did your sensibility change at all about, yeah, that's where I'm going, whether you became more or less sympathetic? Because there's a very intense atmosphere in the Middle East in a lot of countries. I mean, it's an omnipresent sense of something is going to happen or something can happen. Did you feel yourself being pushed sympathetically, or did you not connect to that at all? Because
Sympathy. I don't think that any of what I experienced made an impression on my tendencies for sympathy. However, I did empathize with the groups of people that I worked with and came in contact with. And they were always very generous with me and honest with me about their politics, their position, and there were so many. I mean, you think about the issues in that particular region as Palestinian, Israeli, these kind of polarities. But actually, a lot of what I was involved with was, again, I say the word micro-communities within Jerusalem specifically, because I didn't really navigate outside of Jerusalem. So I can't speak for the entire country, the entire state. But so within Jerusalem itself, which tends to be noticed as the capital of Israel, but I believe it's Tel Aviv, no?
I think it is.
Yeah. So anyway, there's a kind of ideology that Jerusalem is the center of Israel, and all of its municipality is held there. And as I was going in and out of the whole spectrum, from very Zionist groups to very, very left groups, everyone that I came in contact with, there was a bond, in a sense, of empathy between the two of us, or between the groups, because there was at some point a sense of familiarity, being locked into or born into a situation that you have to make do. So I also wrote about this in the blog. I made the statement that it's at what cost. And so actually I was starting to find these kind of quotes among many different parties that didn't know each other, that would always say at what cost. And so they would make a claim of the family that they came from, and they would discuss what they're currently fighting for or against, and then they would say, but at the end of the day, at what cost? Because there's this notion that every other summer there's a huge war. So when you sent me, thankfully, it was the down summer. So this was the summer to, recuperate before potentially the next summer of war. So they did mention, they as in these different parties of people that I was meeting, when there is a fired arm or some kind of kidnapping or some kind of crazy conflict that's made an impression both locally and globally, the left go right. So there's this kind of fear of one's family and one's situation in terms of being a member of the state. So that's kind of what draws them into protecting the notion of being a part of Jerusalem and the larger issues of Israel. So, just to be clear, I was specifically meeting groups of people within Jerusalem and institutions within Jerusalem. So I was, speaking to people that are pretty liberal. A lot of them have studied or had family that have lived in the U.S. or in Europe. They're very critical of the state, but they also are very aware of their situation, that their family and their roots are there in Israel. So it's just super complex structurally, but not necessarily a complicated issue, because when I observe these issues, it comes from a kind of individual viewpoint, and I'm very interested in what happens to people and their daily lives on the field, and I tend to stay away from making any kind of positional gestures or statements about the state itself, because it's just so invisible and there's this kind of divinity to it, and communities of people, they get together, they riot, it happened when I was there actually. The Ethiopian Jewish community there was a huge protest in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, right next door to the neighborhood that I was staying in while I was there. But in the end, you have this kind of invisible cloak of the state that takes what happens on the field and writes it in a way that solidifies it in history in a way that's complicated for anyone to access what really happened.
One of the things that we talk about with residents that come to New York is that within the first couple of days they are asked directions, because they fit in so easily in New York. Now, you don't look a lot like an Israeli, and especially in Israel, you could well tend to look more Arabic than Israel. Did you find this? Was there a consciousness within you? Did you feel the other? How much did you start to identify or not identify with Israel being there?
So that's an interesting question in terms of one's facile identity, because it is a state made up of diasporic people. So there are Israelis that obviously
Ethiopian.
went all over the world, and then there was a call to come back to this space. So actually there are so many different looking people that are Israeli within Jerusalem, because it is a big city. I can't speak for other parts of Israel. So at first I did feel quite alienated, and I made these jokes that I felt like I was back in Texas in the 80s, because in the 80s, like a Pakistani Muslim Indian family in a small town along the Bible Belt was quite odd as well. So there was a bit of a familiarity with this kind of otherness. However, I was inhabiting a really interesting neighborhood, Nachlaut, and it is kind of an old traditional Orthodox community, but in the past, I would say 10 years, because Jerusalem's quite expensive to live in, there's a kind of new crop of people. They're young students, international cultural producers that are living there, so it's actually quite a creative neighborhood. So I was hanging out essentially with kind of like the new wave Israelis, like the younger kids that were there. And they all would claim, actually, you look Israeli. I wouldn't have guessed.
Oh, interesting.
And so as I was going to these events,
Ashkenazi.
yeah, I do look Polish, I have to say. But I'm joking. But as I was going to different events and meeting different people, there was these moments where, let's say I'm at the Israeli Museum, which was one of the events that I went to. There was a woman that just came up to me, don't know her, she wasn't a part of the program, she just comes up to me and she says, hi, I'm a photographer in Jerusalem and I would like to photograph you. I like your look. So then I'm like, okay. And she's like, oh, do you speak Hebrew? No. Oh, are you Israeli? No. And she was like, oh, I wanted to photograph specifically Israeli people. And so we would just shake hands and, so there are these moments where people would come up to me that just assume, or they would ask for directions. Like, this phenomena of being a New Yorker, you're a New Yorker when people start coming up to you and asking for directions. So this happens as well. And then that's what affected my sense of perception, because all of a sudden that's all I knew. Living in this place, living in Jerusalem, was like living in New York or any of my past became like this imagination, and I was living in the present, and that's all I knew. So there was this weird perception of reality for me constantly, and that's just who I am, because this happens all the time. So in that sense, it was oil and water. Like, I would feel completely alienated and on the other side, but then I would also at times feel completely involved and within the personal politics of different communities. And it actually, all the different neighborhoods are quite different, and they have a different draw of people. So maybe if I were going to a different neighborhood, I would experience a kind of quick judgmental stare.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, again, I'm from Texas. This is par for the course, This is the way people sniff each other out, We're like dogs,
So what did you turn to, like, for that, not home comfort, but that sense of familiarity when you were there?
You mean in terms of a kind of comfort to calm my
Yeah,
nerves when I
yeah.
felt nervous?
What did you reestablish? Some people plant the foliage from their home when they move somewhere to create the familiarity.
Well, I watched Transparent, which is a TV show,
Yeah?
while I was there. That helped somehow calm my nerves, and it was just an excellent show. I recommend
It is, yeah.
Actually, I did recommend it on my Facebook feed. And then I also turned to music, and in a way, it was interesting when Art Cube and apexart sent me to the Jerusalem Cinema House. It was sort of the peak of where I experienced so many amazing things, and then there was this peak of kind of a crisis where I felt not frightened, but I just felt the pressure, this sort of lineage and this historical idea as my background. Like, I felt this pressure, and I also felt people, this kind of negativity I just felt. And it was actually the day after the protests, so I was wondering while I was there if I was experiences, as people say, when there's some kind of conflict, people get tight, they're about protecting themselves. So I felt that I really did experience that, and I experienced a few people being quite rude to me, and I wondered if it was about me being a young kid, or if it was about, what I looked like, or if it was just that they had a canker sore and they were just pissed, and they were going to be pissed at everyone they saw, So for me, I was really, again, trying to be neutral and not try to assume that there was something happening that was about this kind of political notion of Arab versus Israeli, or like Palestinian versus Israeli. So I was really trying to stay neutral and understand it from a kind of larger perspective. But as you say, what did I turn to? One of the events was going to the Jerusalem cinema and watching a pianist from China who was playing Chopin. And I remembered when I was in graduate school, I also turned to Chopin. And Rachmaninoff also, and it was, again, this kind of memory of something that I did turn to, and it was sort of folded within the research and events. So after going to that event, I would listen to, piano concerts constantly, at home. As I would fall asleep, sometimes I would try to find a way to play music while I was walking the streets, but my phone broke halfway through, so I actually was sort of without that access of like closing people out through the sound, which I'm sure also New Yorkers are very familiar with, that we always play our pods so you don't see what's around you. So yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is I turned to music and some really good television shows like Transparent.
So it's been a while now, but do you remember feeling comfortable after a week or after 2 weeks? You know, where you just kind of melted into the...
I think it was the second week. The first week, it seemed like the first week all of the things I did were going to a stadium to see soccer. The Catamon games were happening, which the Catamon games are the third league soccer of Jerusalem specifically, and they're very much about inclusion. So they would include people from the old city in the Christian quarter, Muslim quarter. They had some Palestinian players. They also were very interested in gay rights, and they would have like pride flags on the campus. So what I'm saying is that the first week it seemed like I was going to events that were quite official, and I would have to go through thresholds where they would do security checks. And as an American, you just go to things and there's like a metal detector you just go through. You're never like checked, you're never like questioned who you are, where you come from. It's not like a daily activity here, but it is, in a way, it can be at times a daily activity in Jerusalem. And that was hard for me, but then by the second week it was sort of like, okay, this is what people do, and I get it in a way. So again, I tried to not put myself in this binary of other, because I do have a traditional Arabic name, so when people do learn my name, they have a lot of questions for me. But again, like, I really tried to be...
Especially at the borders.
Yes, especially at the borders. But like I say, I am a gray pixel. Like, I don't want to position myself, because I understand that you constantly have to be in movement in order to understand the picture. So that's kind of what I always came back to when I felt this kind of pressure, politics or religion or...
Okay, one quick political question, then I'm going to go on to something else, but I'm just curious about this. Did you find yourself becoming more, and you don't have to expand on this, excuse me, did you find yourself becoming more sympathetic to the narrative that you had gone there with, that is the prevalent narrative?
What is that?
Did you feel that, did you feel more of a sense of aggression or more of a sense of defense?
The dominant narrative being Free Palestine? Or is that just from like a New York artist?
Yeah, I would say just the general situation, because Palestine, of course, is one issue. Egypt is another. Syria is another. Lebanon, another. We were just in Lebanon, and we were expecting the primary opponent to be Israel, but of course it turned out to be ISIS. And I even wondered if at some point ISIS will make the Middle East come together in some way to deal with it, because Lebanon would much rather deal with Israel than they would with ISIS. So I wondered if you were, you know, whenever you're around people, there's, it's not Munchausen's, it's Patty Hearst. Do you know that name? Do you remember she was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, and then she slowly become sympathetic to the group that you are against just by proximity. And I wondered if your political sense was kind of ping pong balling around, like,
I see.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about this quite a bit. We, as in the friends that I made. I have very good friends in Israel now that are Israeli, which is kind of bizarre. That's another conversation.
No, because I'm going to ask you why it's
Yeah, yeah.
bizarre. Yeah.
Well, that's another question. Okay, so you're asking really a powerful question. I am more dedicated now as an artist to issues of human rights. It's not, I don't mean to tiptoe around being direct with my answer, but what that did to me, the experience what that did to me was it radicalized me towards something that I was always afraid of, like the power inside of me as an artist to make work and make it quick and not be so hesitant about what I make. Because I mean, that's been the big problem, right, for me, is that I never understood the power that I had to speak, and I didn't think that it was important, and I didn't think I was smart enough. You know, you have all these, you know, personal issues that get in the way of your question. It made me not sympathize on any level. It made me just want to be more active and be a little bit more vocal about what I see, not necessarily what I feel. And in a way, it made me feel stronger about how important it is for America to support countries that are truly democratic and that are interested in a state that gives its people all equal rights. And I didn't see necessarily Israel doing that, and at least from Jerusalem. I didn't see that because Jerusalem is placed in a it's like a you know, like flies have these eyes that are really big and they can see all the way around their body, and so when you try to slap it, they know that's coming way before you can even do it. So I feel like Jerusalem is that fly's eye in a way, and anytime and you walk into the old city and you go up on the walls and you can look through these narrow holes and you can see what is called Palestinian territory, even though it is in a way part of Israel and Jerusalem. And you see how distinctly different those communities are from where I was living. And that was...
You went into Ramallah?
I did.
Yeah.
Apex sent me into Ramallah and Bethlehem. And yeah, and so you just see these distinctly different, like a switch. It's like almost like someone broke the bulb in the room, and then all of a sudden things are a little darker, you know. And I had a lot of questions about how that's possible. Like, is this a totally different government? Do they have different funding? But what I understood was it is a part of Jerusalem. They do have Israeli passports, but there's an insignia, a number on the passport that defines them to be the other. But they're still paying the same taxes, for example. And this sort of thing, it didn't allow me to sympathize. It just allowed me to want to apply pressure the way I can inside spaces where I can speak and it matters. And it's not about what I'm trying to say is I'm more critical of the US I didn't walk out of it being more critical of Israel. I became more critical of the U.S. And I became more critical of myself, wanting to understand history more. And some of the things that stuck out the most were when you want to understand what community is Arab versus Christian versus Jewish, not talking about issues of secularism or just talking about the kind of tribal identity of these religions. You can tell by water tanks that are on the Christian and Muslim houses, whereas the Jewish communities, the plumbing is installed within, so you don't have these tanks of water on the top. So one of the issues with that is that the tanks, if there isn't water in it, it rusts, and so there's constantly this like reproducing of these tanks, and it just provides this kind of unevenness with just a bit of the daily life. Then I also learned that there is issues with just like city picking up trash, and so it did seem like these communities seemed a little filthier. And some of the narratives that I would receive were these communities, their culture is to be filthy. And that kind of public address for me was hard to stomach, because I live in New York and I understand issues of gentrification quite well, and I understand when there's a community in New York that seems a little filthier. I know what's going on. Like, there's no trash pickup. There's no, like, there's like a squelching of funding that goes to that neighborhood. So I kind of came with my own, education of the micro villages that I come from in Brooklyn, so I kind of was grafting that experience on these conversations. And I mean, I can go on. That's probably one of the more critical things I have to say about some of the narratives I received, that they were cloaked in a kind of propaganda, but from both sides. Mm-hmm. But there is the language is really interesting to deconstruct, because it is in the language that issues are pushed. And there's heavy tourism in the regions of Israel from all over the world. And so actually what I want to be more critical about within Israel itself is the language and the way in which people describe histories and spaces and current issues. The text, the narrative itself that's given to people that don't know anything about these spaces because they're tourists, it's a big problem. So I don't know where to go from there, but I think that like issues of syntax and language was really interesting for me to just hesitate and like just question what was being said to me.
The Palestinian situation surely is a complex one. Mm-hmm. And I think we go there oversimplifying it a lot as
kind of
two sides. Yeah. And the Arab community, because of religious partitions within the Arab community, I think I expected the Palestinians to get more support from the outside Arab community, and there's none. So that was kind of interesting for me to learn the religious implications, the fact that I'm not sure if there are the proper incentives to resolve the situation. Okay.
I wonder if that's partially of the history of the idea of the numbers of refugees, in a sense, that were displaced in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan, in, parts of Syria, Canada, like the displacement of millions of people applies a kind of pressure to countries, and that it creates new problems, new issues. You know, I kind of see it from that perspective. And I also, in a way, was making parallels to other crises that are happening. For example, the flotillas that are coming through North Africa, Syria, into South Italy, which after the residence, the fellowship, I spent the rest of my time away in South Italy, right at one of the ports that has traditionally been one of the largest intakes of immigrant flotillas. So this idea of these large groups of people being displaced from a kind of interiority of politics or
One of the things that I found interesting is that Europe was very critical of the racism in the US until they started having other races come into their country, when all of a sudden they were not as liberal. So all of the Africans, or even Albanians still in Italy, it's a serious political issue. So, give me an example that you remember of something that made you uncomfortable in Israel. Are there a discussion or situation or whatever?
Are you sure you want me to share that with you publicly?
I am not taking any sides. And yes.
Well, as I say, it was the latter half of the second week. And it was around the park where I think they call it the first rail. I think there was a train station that traditionally connected totally different neighborhoods. I think Arab neighborhood to an Israeli neighborhood. And now it's just a monument. Like there's beautiful plush areas, a lot of cultural activity, a cinema. So it was around that time that I say before this kind of peak where I went to the cinema, but to get there I was totally confused because, and part of my uncomfortability is within my own self. I'm totally addicted to my phone and I didn't have it, and I was in this new place. I didn't speak Hebrew, and you know, I was forced to have to figure things out with my eyes and my notions of north, south, east, and west, which I have none. And it was really difficult to try to find this place because the communities are like catacombs, you know, they're like places within places within places. So it was really hard for me to find this place that everyone would be like, oh yeah, it's over there, you know? So that was a difficult day in and of itself, was trying to find this place. And then I find it, and then I'm sitting down to something that I really want to know what these people are saying at this piano concert, but they're speaking Hebrew. And so I'm like, if you just try hard enough, you'll know the language. And so I would just like really try to understand each word, but it never resolved itself.
No similarity.
Okay, so yes, I do not speak Hebrew. And there was no divine like will for me to understand the language all of a sudden. But so that was frustrating. And then I walk out from the park, and to describe the way I looked, and I think it's important because look is very important in Israel. I wouldn't say that in the US you wake up in the morning and you put something on for a political gesture, but maybe it is if we thought about it that way. I'm wearing jeans. I mean,
Yeah,
that is
we
super
are wearing
political.
uniforms, right?
But so everyone wears their kerchief in a specific way, and that tells you something about where they land on a graft of politics.
Really?
The women, they wear their skirts at a certain level, and it shows you what level of left to right politics they're involved with.
I didn't know.
The hoses that women were wearing, not hoses, the shoes. It depends on what brand. If you're wearing a certain brand, it means you're coming from a certain level of politics. Everything is grafted onto the body.
Right.
And we talk about in the US, what is grafted as your identity is the level of pigment in your skin. But there it's all about the clothing and the arrangement, and it's very meticulous, and it's very purposed, and it's talked about. So I say, what did I look like that day? Usually I wear my hair tied up on my head, or I tie it in one of these things, these braids, and it's a lot of hair, and I just want it out of my way, and I want to live my life. But that day, I brushed my hair, and that's a big thing for me, to brush the hair. It takes a while, and it was clean, and I just woke up, and it was kind of a warm day, and it was actually quite chilly there, and so I left my hair down. And I was walking around with my camera strapped to my back, which everyone does. Like, everyone has a camera strapped to their back because there's so many things to capture on a daily basis. And I was wearing a dress, the hem of the dress went down below my knees. It was very modest because normally I just sort of dress modestly anyway. But I looked quite nice, I have to say. I was wearing a sun hat. I walk out from the cinema, and I'm walking past the park onto some of the streets to head back to the city center, which is where my neighborhood was located. And there was an older man who looked quite distinguished, but he was religious, who started screaming and yelling at me. And at first I was kind of like, what's happening? Like, did I drop something? And then I decided that this might be one of those situations where I'm running into, an issue where I met the one person that was just extreme. And there's an extreme person in every culture, and he extremely didn't like my presence. And he wanted to make it vocal to me and everyone around me, and that made me uncomfortable, but I was also quite rational about it because it's not personal. But then somehow, as I walked away from it, I just kind of broke down, and it was like this point where I was just tired. I almost wanted to go home. I felt confused and alone, and I kind of just broke down. And it was on a Saturday, so everything was closed, because usually from 4 p.m. Friday night to about 5 or 8 on Saturday, things are closed down, and there's 1 or 2 restaurants that are open, but the buses don't work. So, it was a mixture of a bit of fatigue because you walk everywhere, which I walk everywhere in New York anyways, but, I was a little tired. I had just come out from this amazing concert, music that really, moves me, and then I have this situation where I'm meeting this person who made me very uncomfortable.
Okay, so one of the things that we say to people before they leave is that we expect you to be lonely. Mm-hmm. We expect you to be depressed.
Oh, do
What's
you?
the other one? Lonely, depressed.
You expect us to be depressed.
Bored, yeah. Alternately, not for the whole time, but when you go someplace and we set up a strong support network, but we don't set up a strong friendship kind of situation because we want people to be on their own. You have different experiences when you're on your own versus having people take you around and you see different things. So we intentionally do that because we want people to have the full range of emotion, and it sounds like you did.
I did have a full range of emotions, and I was alone. I was alone most of the time, and I really appreciated that.
Without your phone.
Without the phone.
Nice thing. You learn you can do it. Huh?
I did. I learned many things about what I can do, but I think the program. I really think you have something really dynamic. I am a big fan. I think the program was, it's a really important mark in what I will do in the future. In fact, I'm actually going to speak at a Allied Media Conference in Detroit in 2 days. And part of what I'll be discussing is the kind of complexities of the issue of art in exile. So I am super loyal, and I feel like many of the things that I'll experience in the future will be from the experiences that your organization helped and supported me to do. And
Right.
also I want to come back to the region, so I'm hoping that maybe our apexart will help me go back.
We will call anybody for you. I forgot where I was going to go with that. It's not an abnormal situation when people come back and experience it that they do want to return, which is always a nice situation. One of the things that I found, just to touch on the art world for a moment, because you were in the art world, is that, and I think you referenced it earlier, is that every artist is a political artist. Even if they just draw flowers, they somehow tie it to the political situation. Did you find that to be a positive or preoccupying situation for artists in any way?
That they can't unmoor themselves from politics?
Yeah.
I think that art and politics, or an artist can't separate themselves from politics, is one issue, but then there's another issue of artists who use politics as a medium. So it's not an easy answer, because some people are directly using media and the languages of politics itself to craft their own narrative or make their own objects. But then there are other artists that, I think I posted issues about the poppy on the blog, and then I showed some flowers from Van Gogh or something like this. But like the idea of painting a still life, which is quite political, but it's only political insofar as if you choose to read it in that way, but it's there. There are other pieces of artwork that they actually deliberately take, a kind of political issue, and they craft it into an object. And actually, sometimes that stuff is so apolitical compared to still life. In my opinion, some of the work that's done directly about political issues empties out any power. So
It's an interesting contrast for me, because I find that in the U.S. there is a lack of political concern among artists.
well, who can blame someone for wanting to just live their daily life? It's hard enough as it is. But yeah, I mean, the U.S. is a unique place. It's so large, and there are pockets of the U.S. where you just have to contend with nature or just your daily life, and you are so far away from any kind of mediated news or politics, or you're in a situation where you're just wealthy enough to be able to live a kind of neutral life. And you can do that here, and actually you can do that in Israel too. I actually talked to a couple of people that were problematizing this idea of living in a highly contested place but living a super essentially apolitical life. It's possible. You can do it.
Like we do here.
And in fact, you can even do it in Ramallah. I mean, you have these kind of larger issues of not having internet, and there's this kind of question of Orange in the news currently about wanting to give internet service to settlements that are outside of the line. But that's really going into it. Like, if you go into it, you're connected back into the idea of politics, but you can choose to live mentally outside of it. And I think a lot of people do that in the U.S., and it's my own personal opinion that I believe we're trained at a very young age to just live our lives very passively, but mentally actively because of all of the stuff that we're seeing on TV or HBO. Or, I mean, when I was watching Transparent, I really felt that I was inside something for real, but it was just a TV show, you know? For example, like I was really into it and I felt like I was a part of this family, but in the end it was just, you know, a TV show.
Well, such an interesting idea, and a way to be watching that there.
Yeah.
And Israel is particularly liberal in terms of gay
And transgenders.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so give me a big takeaway. Could be a skill, could be a person, could be an orientation.
Big takeaway. Wasn't this whole conversation a big takeaway?
Well, I didn't know if you had one that you might, you know, it could even be a cooking skill.
I know. The big takeaway is don't procrastinate. I know that's so simple, but...
Did you before?
I think everyone does, don't you? I mean, just like in the sense of, well, okay, so talking about me, like, it's not like a procrastinate a deadline or something like that. It's like just procrastinate living. Like, if I want to do something, then you just do it, and you don't wait till the next day to do it, you know? It's even like, even if you end up doing it the next day, it's just not the same, or won't provide you with the same impact if you have the idea and you do it. And
Getting out of the apartment.
yeah, getting out of the apartment, as simple as that. You know, there'd be a night where I was exhausted and I thought, you know, I want to draw a circle on the map and just walk the perimeter of that. And you have that idea and then you're like, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. But really, if you could just do it when you had that idea, granted you had the time to do it, it just like kind of puts you in a place where you realize you can't wait to do things. You just have to do them in whatever capacity that you have. And that was my takeaway, is that I can't wait any longer. I just want to make the work that I know how to do with the skill level that I have now, instead of waiting for something to come along. And so that's kind of in a way what this program gave me, you know.
And what about a cultural takeaway?
Cultural takeaway? Let's see, food-wise, clothing-wise.
Something that you experienced there and are somehow adopting it or adapting it to here. And it could be food, it could be clothing, it could be a sense of discussion about political situations that was certainly more on the surface there for you. The procrastination issue, you know, it's about time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the cultural issue for me is to press myself more to wrap myself around other languages. And I think that part of going back to your other question of Americans and issues of sort of nuances of politics, I think that we're also trained to speak one language, and that is the dominant language
In the US.
globally. And I think that's really, in a way, hurting our society. And I think for me, I can read Arabic and sort of speak Urdu because that's what my family speaks to me, but I don't practice. And so the big takeaway for me was I'm going to continue to learn Hebrew and Arabic, and in hopes to go back to the region, because you can only communicate with people insofar as what you can speak. So that's the big takeaway, is to continue learning languages.
A friend of mine who's Polish artist, did a piece, and it was a banner, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly, but said that something to the effect of, good artists speak English. And it was a really provocative situation, brought up the discussion as you're talking about suppression of individual culture and such. But then there's also that aspect of communication that it affords. We have a bit of a conundrum in that our residents really have to speak
English.
TOEFL 3 English to come, but yet we don't have to make sure that you speak Hebrew to go, or even Korean to go there.
Yes.
So, it's an interesting negative, but it's also an interesting positive in that the level of communication has increased so much by the universal, which kind of happens to be English. So, we're not far from the end here. Julia mentioned that you discovered maybe in another life you should have been a writer. Yeah?
She said
Well,
that
she mentioned that you had
see.
mentioned that to her.
See, yeah, I always had this strange relationship to text, whether it was learning to read a text which I did not understand the spoken language to, which is Arabic, or speaking in English in response to someone speaking to me in Urdu, or trying to read and write and communicate in English, but never having the appropriate amount of time to understand the language in full, because I'm always in between these other languages. So I've always had a strange relationship to the idea of literature and my ability for it. So I dismissed it, and I continued along a kind of visual track, doing narrative painting, oddly enough. And then now I'm doing kind of narrative videos. And I just always thought, I'm not a writer. I don't know how to write. I'm not good at grammar. I always misspell words. I think you probably noticed that in my texts. But I think I developed a way to communicate that describes feelings and the way you can see, because it's the only way I could communicate in the other in-between languages. So maybe I developed a way of communicating that I actually just chose to start writing down a couple of years ago, because I've experienced this kind of interiority lately, and I can talk to myself, so I just write to myself. And so yeah, in a way, I just expressed to Julia that maybe that's the big takeaway. And that's what I mean maybe by procrastination, is that you think you have this ability, but you sort of set it aside. But then the blog gave me this opportunity to be a bit more public about my thoughts and my voice. And I put it out there along with some photographs that I've taken, and I really had a good time doing it. And I feel like I've struggled with mediums and presentations of my artwork, and writing gave me this agility and this kind of ambition that I haven't felt in a long time.
But your blog was not long. Did you do a lot of writing
Yeah.
that was not on the blog?
Yes. I pretty much wrote every day.
So why didn't you write on the blog?
It was hard to post as many times as I wanted to. Logistically, it was hard to post. And also, I felt that there were things that I wrote about that were very impulsive, and I felt too intimate, and I wanted to not alter them, but just have them sit for a while before I went public with it. And the idea of writing every day was about taking the biggest bite out of my experience. It wasn't about making something. It was really just about wanting to remember the textures, remember the experiences, and knowing that I have this kind of what I call perceptual illness, where I forget everything that happens, and then only can see what's in front of me, you know. So it was really.
You're not unique that way, yes.
Yeah, we all have this illness. So I didn't post because I felt first that some of the things were just a bit more intimate.
Which is, of course, what we want.
It is, in a way, but then there was logistical issues.
Can you go back and add, do you think?
I
Not to
actually
take
am.
away the spontaneity, but
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is, and actually, I think I was talking to Larissa and Julia about this the other day, that I felt like going back and reading it, and looking at the photographs and some of the audio, that there's a book in and of itself, and so that's kind of what I'm excited about, and this kind of takeaway is that putting it together can become a bit of a book for me that I could bring to you, you know, as a gesture.
which would be very nice. Now, however, other people don't have access to it. And we find that people get so much out of other people's blogs that we encourage people. And the thing is, I think, and we find this in all of our book essays and our, for the exhibitions, the brochures, that art writing especially has become very arm's length. And that in a desire to be more academic, we have created a very superficial language that doesn't address things, but yet shows our erudition. I mean, because you know we're there. So we're trying. We encourage people to be as honest and vulnerable as they can, because it seems like this is what other people need to read. You know, to validate that they can feel that way. Your experience with the therapist in Israel. I always like to ask if it was your first experience with a therapist, but then some people don't really want to disclose whether it was or wasn't.
Oh no, I'm quite open about any kind of experience that I've had, and I've had hilarious dabblings with therapy when I was in undergraduate school, because universities have this health system. So through those health systems, you usually can get therapy for under $5 if you're working with a PhD student. So I had some hilarious dabblings with that when I was growing up in undergraduate school, and then recently at Cornell University, they have great health insurance and a great education, and so I would go and do therapy there, and it's interesting. It's an interesting relationship, and somehow I always end up where I almost have a role reversal, and I'm like helping them with an issue, and that was my experience there at Cornell. And then every Monday when I was in Israel and in Jerusalem, I went and met with a therapist, and I felt, I even told her this, I felt that for the first time I was experiencing a kind of a relationship that seemed normal to me, where I was going in there to have a relationship with someone who was giving me therapy or giving me advice in a way. And it was interesting. It was an interesting experience to have, because there's all these like 14 levels of pressure in Jerusalem, from like religious issues, political issues, personal issues, and to go into this safe place and to have a discussion about what you've experienced on a week basis. It was an interesting experience, and knowing also that it was a short, limited time. You know, I was only going to meet with her 4 times. that kind of changed a relationship that the patient has with their therapist, because normal
Stranger on a train phenomenon.
yeah, a little bit. And you always have the best conversation of your life with a stranger. So,
And maybe the fact that she wasn't a graduate student.
yeah, there's that. Well, I mean, at Cornell, I was working with a professional, but yeah.
Okay, so you found it to be a positive experience.
It
yes?
was a positive experience.
Okay. Okay, so in just finishing up here, I'll ask you if there's anything that you both want to add to the conversation that I didn't ask you, and what criticism you might have for us or them. Something that.
That's going to be a hard question to answer, because it feels like it didn't happen now, because it's been 2 weeks since I've been here and living my life. A question I have for you, I had many at the time, but now, I mean, I guess the question is, what is the relationship that you have with former fellows? I'm interested in the future of where does the experience sit in the timeline of apexart?
Okay. We send follow-up questionnaires to our residents, 1 month, 3 month, 1 month, 6 month, and a year. And a year?
In a year, yes.
And after we send you the first one, maybe we'll give you access to the file for all of them. I would say that the main issue of the program is that the art world has become very incestuous and non-critical in much of the work. And what we're trying to do is act as a creative catalyst, yeah. So to give you new information to draw on from your work. You notice we try and keep you out of the art world because we don't want that comfort that comes from being in the familiar situation.
It's not comfortable for me.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. I mean, the art world all over the world is very similar. Issues are similar. The web is now the thing that ties people. And I kind of have a sense that the creative world is kind of diluting culture around the world, because we've got this international style of artwork. People are referencing international work, so the idiosyncratic things that artists used to do culturally are becoming less involved in their work, and the work seems to be self-referencing to the art world a lot. So, to answer your question, I would say almost invariably these turn out to be life-changing experiences for people, whether by content or situation. But the main benefit, I think, is stopping doing what they're doing so that there's an opportunity to reevaluate and experience new things. I think it is the program of which I am most proud, yeah. And I think it accomplishes the most.
I would agree with you.
And I think, you're a good example of that.
And then the other question you asked was, are there any criticisms? again, it's hard to say because I would need to kind of think through that.
1 month is a good amount of time.
Actually, the idea of being outside of your experience and the ideas of boredom, depression, being alone, in a way I was only just experiencing that towards the end, because you are entertained, in a way, or your sensory system is so alive when you experience something new that you could just be seeing an ant cross along the sidewalk and think it's the most fascinating thing because you're in this new place, and what does it mean to see an ant crossing along the sidewalk on Nissim Bakar in Jerusalem, And so actually that feeling of daily life, boredom, depression, potentially was happening towards the end. So it's not necessarily a criticism, it's more a curiosity. What happens if it's longer?
The reason, by the way, we keep it as a month is because people can figure out, our residents have to be over 30, so they're generally involved in either teaching or something that is a responsible thing. 1 month is 2 weeks, clearly too short. People can take a 2-week vacation and then call in sick for 2 weeks.
I see.
So that a month is probably about
So it's more logistic.
Yeah, because we don't want people that are not doing anything,
I see.
that have all of that time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to throw you 2 softball questions. They just have to be like 3-word answers unless you want to go into it. The favorite person you met and the favorite food you ate.
The favorite food that I ate was, drum roll please, hummus and fool. And I think I might have found, on my own wits, I think I might have found the best place right outside Damascus Gate for that entree. Then my favorite person that I met. It was the night of, I'm saying it so quickly because it's almost like I already knew who it was, but it was a food critic, I think is his profession, that I met the night that I was asked to go to the David Citadel event, the night of Independence Day. And then Independence Day turned into Remembrance Day. So it was I think it was something about what I was experiencing, from this kind of like laughter and joyousness to this moment of total fear and silence. And then I meet this person and we were just talking about food and how amazing and complex and political food is, right at the crux of the change. So I think it was a little bit about the time in which I met this person and then the conversation that we had that sort of solidified this, in a way, friendship, even though I know that we weren't supposed to make friends. Or I'm joking about that.
that is not
I'm
true.
I'm
you
joking.
weren't supposed to meet
No,
artists, but
yes,
you were
that's
supposed
true.
to make friends.
I'm kidding, but that was a bit of an interior joke that I'm not supposed to make friends, but I'm joking about that. But so yeah, I feel like I made a friend, and of course he's one of many people that I met that are really amazing. Yeah.
Okay. The best thing you can do for us is to give us high points and low points, not now,
Sure.
for subsequent situations.
Okay.
Mayan was a good host.
Great.
Good.
Everybody there, Mayan, Leron, and Lihi, they were, hopefully, we continue our friendship. So
Yeah, no, they're very enthusiastic about the program,
yeah.
and I think they found it to be a good.
Yeah, in a way, we were all sort of learning new things through my experience, so that was also interesting.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, thank you, Baseera.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you from Bachi and me. And